Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of That NextGen Planners Podcast. You are joined by me, Amelia Hamilton, your head of community here at NextGen Planners, as well as always, my two wonderful co-hosts. We've got Taylor Beavis.
Hello.
And we've got Clara Metcalf.
Hi.
Welcome both to the podcast. Pleasure to have you here as always. And we are joined by a brilliant guest today in the podcast in the form of Iona Bain, who is an award-winning broadcaster, journalist, speaker, and author who specializes in all things money. Welcome, Iona. So nice to have you with us.
Oh, thank you very much for that very kind introduction.
Well, very more deserved. I feel like I was writing an introduction for you. You go, there's too much to fit in here. Let's just not go into any detail. Just give the broad overview. And I'm sure as this podcast unfolds, people will get to know all of the wonderful nooks and crannies of everything that you are working on all the time. I don't know how you fit it in. As soon as you Google your name, you're like, how is she doing all of this? I have no idea.
Yeah, the classic swan analogy, isn't it? I am gracefully on the surface whilst my feet are paddling away furiously.
Yeah, well, you're doing an excellent job gliding away. So the first question we have for you is, actually, it is money related. Usually it's not so much, but we have been set a question for you by our previous guest, Steve Nelson, and he wants to know, and we're very excited to hear your opinion on this. Do you think that Martin Lewis has any kind of secret financial shame? For a man who gives advice about everything, seems to be on top of everything, do you think he's late with any parking tickets? Do you think that he's missed any payments? Do you think there's something lurking in his closet that we don't know about that's going to come out in 10 years' time? What do you think?
I think that is such a hard question because my initial reaction is no, he has got no financial skeletons in his closet. Like he has to be probably the most organized man in the country when it comes to his finances. Having said that, though, maybe he spends a bit too much on coffee because he is quite wired, isn't he? And he does deliver his advice very, very rapidly. So I'm wondering if that is pure caffeine coursing through his veins, and therefore maybe he spends a wee bit too much on lattes. Who knows?
I'm sure he's not the only one. I think probably that goes to be the case for my whole generation. Our whole generation is probably the same.
True.
But that actually brings me on nicely to our first question. And for the podcast today, we're going to be looking specifically towards younger people and looking at that wealth gap and exploring all of the issues around that within financial advice. And so you spent years researching and writing about young people's financial habits. Just to kick things off, what do you think are some of the biggest misconceptions that financial planners have about millennial and Gen Z clients or their spending habits in general?
Sure. Well, I think first of all, we have to separate those two generations. And obviously, we need to add the caveat that overgeneralizing is unhelpful. But I think we can observe some trends. So when it comes to the millennial generation, I mean, we're talking now about people who are, well into their 30s in many cases. I'm a millennial. I'm going to be 37 in a couple of weeks' time. And I have recently bought a house with my partner. Might look to start a family in the next few years. I'm in that more advanced stage of my career. Our generation's very much coming of age and growing up. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that all millennials are in a position to buy property, to save and to invest. Having said that, I think within the media, there is sometimes this narrative that all millennials are doomed to rent in pokey flats for the rest of their life, or they have to move back home with their parents, boomeranging back to the family nest, and that they'll never have any hope of being financially independent. I think that's an excessively gloomy narrative. When you look at the stats, it's clear that there are plenty of millennial professionals who are achieving those goals. But I think it's fair to say they're achieving those goals later. The houses that they do buy are smaller, more modest. They've had to make compromises. They may not be in a position to rebuild their savings very quickly. They're definitely not in a position to oversave for their retirement. And they may well have to have a longer mortgage, which means that they would be paying for their housing costs into their retirement. So I think that's something that needs to be factored into our understanding of the challenges facing that generation. And then when it comes to Gen Z, they're at that earlier stage where they're just starting out in the jobs market, just kind of coming to terms with the big bad world. And I think one particular misconception that I want to try to clear up is whenever I talk about how financial advisors can reach that next generation at conferences, I'm often approached afterwards by a couple of people who feel quite strongly that they can never recruit younger people into their firm because they're bound to come up against this sort of attitude that young people don't want to come into the office and young people don't want to work a hard day and they don't want to get stuck in and try and work their way up in the firm. And sometimes that might happen. I think that was probably true of all generations. You might have a minority of people who aren't really going to, get stuck in. But I do think that actually there are so many hardworking young professionals out there. I meet them. They're incredibly keen to get on. But perhaps they're thinking about their work-life balance in a different way compared to previous generations. They've come of age during COVID. They see and understand that working from home is possible. They may not want to do it all the time. In fact, I meet very few young professionals now who want to work from home full time, but they certainly do want to have that option to do it at least some of the time. So I think it's just about adjusting your culture to take that new world into account. But that doesn't mean that young people don't want to work hard, get on, build their savings, and try to be in a position where in the future they can be kind of financially independent and on their way to having financial wealth and health.
So what do you think the biggest barrier is for the younger generation actually building that wealth?
Yes, I think that is a massive barrier still, whereby if you are leaving education with debt, even though it comes in the form of a graduate tax, when we know now with university student loans that it's not perhaps an immediate debt burden that you have to pay, but it is an ongoing debt burden that definitely makes a difference to how well off younger people feel when they are being squeezed by the rising cost of living and when they are in this situation of having to pay really high rent, which previous generations have not had to contend with in the same way, then they are definitely starting from a worse place. And we do need to have compassion about that because there is only so much hardcore saving that you can do to get out of that situation. Having said that, though, one of my strongest beliefs is that there is no point giving into nihilism. And I think that's definitely a danger among younger people, that they can give up on their futures and decide there is no point trying to save. There's no point trying to build up their financial security. And that they pay, if you like, a bit too much attention to the headlines around the futility of getting on the housing ladder, when actually the story underneath those headlines is much more complex and nuanced. It depends what part of the country you're living in. It depends what kind of job you do. It depends on your skills. There's a lot of variables in there. And of course, it also depends on whether you get help from your family or not. And I do think there's a lot of truth in the idea that we're now not so much in a culture of the difference between the haves and the have-nots, but actually in future, we're going to have the difference between the have-helps and have-no helps. So if you can't rely on your family support, again, you're definitely in a worse position. But I had a motto when I was writing the Young Money blog: don't get mad, get informed. And my advice would be to any young person out there that feels quite daunted about their financial future: don't get mad, get informed about what your options are, what is in your power, and what you can do.
I think, Iona, that's led perfectly onto my question, actually, that I was going to come on to next, which is about getting informed. So as a planner myself and seeing sort of younger children within the clients that I advise, social media is a huge worry for me in terms of getting informed in the right way. Do you yourself see those concerns in terms of the accounts that some of these individuals are following for advice? Crypto is obviously very topical, not so much talking specifically about that, but some pages that I've seen that are really scary in terms of the approach that they're advising people to go down, and almost giving advice. What are your thoughts on that for youngsters?
Absolutely. I think social media can be an absolute minefield for young people who haven't necessarily had a very rigorous financial education, far from it. I mean, yes, financial education is on the curriculum technically, but in reality, it's very patchy. It's not being always delivered at a very high standard. And it really is down to individual teachers to champion the subject. And if they don't feel particularly strongly about it, it tends to go to the bottom of the priority list. And that's understandable because schools have to teach lots and lots of things. So maybe a school thinks, well, doing one workshop on it at the end of the term with a bank coming into the school and basically using it as a chance to market their products at our kids, well, maybe that'll just cut the mustard. So young people are basically having to teach themselves, and social media seems like the most natural first port of call. I think there are some fantastic financial influencers out there. What's interesting is more and more of them actually are training up to be financial advisors. I'm seeing that happening more and more, not perhaps at the level that we would ideally want, but it is a trend that I'm observing. But that still leaves plenty of people out there who don't have any formal qualifications. Now, when it comes to those softer aspects of personal finance, if you like, the more lifestyle, day-to-day aspects of personal finance, I don't think that's a big deal. I don't have an economics degree. I'm not a trained financial advisor. I have, definitely tried to understand the boundaries of my knowledge and tried to expand those as best I can. But I will be the first to resist the label almost of expert. When people call me an expert, I'm not very keen on it because I feel that I'm just taking a bit more of an interest in this subject than your average person. If that makes me more expert, then so be it. But as a journalist, I think that you're trained and conditioned to not really put yourself in the story. I think the best journalists recognize they're mediating between what's going on out there and the reader or the listener or the viewer. And so my job is not necessarily, I think, to tell my audience what to do. It is about giving them the information so that they can then decide. Where I think it becomes more problematic is when influencers are not only telling their followers what to do, but they're actively monetizing that. And young people in particular, they want quick solutions. They want to find that quick path to wealth. And I'm very concerned by the proliferation of passive income courses and forex trading accounts and all sorts of salespeople online who are tapping into that need to be secure that we all have as human beings and are trying to offer easy solutions to that. And those will pick up traction, especially in an economy where the mainstream banking sector still has really low levels of confidence and trust among young people. Young people don't feel that the economy is stacked in their favor. I think it's stacked against them, and therefore they're going to turn to some of those get rich quick solutions. And I think the regulator is recognizing that danger and is trying to act, but you can't be too vigilant, especially because social media platforms themselves have completely absolved themselves of responsibility for trying to stay on top of this problem and to regulate what is on their own platforms.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, sorry, Clara, you go.
I was going to say, if the social media platforms aren't trying to mediate what content's going out there, there's not the trust in the financial services industry that would encourage people to go towards speaking to a regulated financial advisor. How do we, as an industry, go about fixing the problem? What do financial planners maybe need to be doing?
It's an excellent question. And my feeling is that over time, young people, as the social media environment becomes more saturated, and as young people start to understand the wide spectrum of behaviors that you can find on a social media platform, from the trustworthy and the reputable right to the fraudulent end of the spectrum, that they will start to develop a much more mature understanding of what they can and can't trust. And that with that understanding will come this need to find voices that are genuinely authoritative. And I think younger people will seek out those who they recognize have got literally the qualifications to discuss a particular subject. And money is a subject that you need to be especially well qualified to teach others about. I suppose it's okay when it comes to makeup or fashion or anything else. If you're self-taught in those areas, well, good for you. And if you want to share what you've learned, then fantastic. And that could be inspirational. I don't think you need to have any particular kind of special qualification to talk about those areas. But when it comes to finance, when you're getting into certain areas like pensions and investments, you have to know what you're talking about. And younger people are going to seek out those voices that they think know what they're talking about. And I think that's going to be to the advantage of the whole financial advice profession. But the question is, can that profession then take advantage of that rising need for authoritative voices? Because I think if the industry stays where it is at the moment, where it's kind of expecting young people to come to them, I don't think that's really going to work. I don't think that means you have to go all out on social media, jumping on every, cringy trend, putting hashtags at the end of all your posts, doing, videos where you say slay for no apparent reason.
Honestly, I would love to see a lot of people in this profession try and do that. That would be hilarious. I mean, we talk about as a profession the adage we're kind of pale male stale for a lot of it. I'd love to see some of those pale male stale try and do a dance trend on TikTok. Maybe then some people might pay attention to the advice then too.
Maybe it is the answer. Maybe. I don't know. But I think what's more important, I suppose, is kind of engaging seriously with what young people are concerned about when it comes to their finances and offering a service that really adapts to their needs. And yeah, you might want to, throw in a few eye-catching gimmicks here and there, or a few kind of opening gambits to get young people's attention. That's the currency of social media. We know that that's how it works. You've got to do certain things to attract the attention of the algorithm. But I think in order to then sustain loyalty among younger people after that, you've got to back it up with an actual service that could help young people. And so I think that's where we definitely need to do a lot of thinking in the industry. The social media trends, they're fairly easy to copy. What's harder is figuring out how you actually turn those young people into customers.
Just playing devil's advocate here, because I can hear a load of financial planners screaming right now, but they're not our target market. Our target market is somebody who's 10 years away from retirement, has wealth already. What would you say to those people that have those kind of feelings about dealing with this younger target market?
I think there are two very strong reasons why you should be considering that younger target market. Firstly, is that your current generation of clients are not going to live forever. And you will have to find new clients in the future. Now, there is that assumption that as people get older, they will naturally gravitate towards financial advice. I'm not so sure, because I think that might be an assumption based on what has happened in the past, but we haven't had social media in the past. We haven't had search engines in the past. We haven't had a surfeit of consumer websites in the past. So we haven't had a generation coming of age with a whole lot of financial information online that, as far as they're concerned, suits their needs perfectly well. And therefore, that's what you're competing against. So you can't necessarily assume that younger generation of people, as they get older and they acquire more wealth, are just going to naturally come to you. And also, there may be plenty of young people who won't necessarily acquire a substantial amount of wealth over the course of their lifetimes. Does that mean that they aren't, worthy of some kind of financial advice, even if it's not full financial advice, even if it's kind of more semi-skimmed guidance or coaching? But surely there is something that we can do for them. And just because they don't have a huge pension or lots of investments doesn't mean that they don't have some disposable income that they wouldn't be able to put towards having a helpful steer on how to manage their finances. And then I think, obviously, the really big reason why is inheritance. Now, we know that the average age of inheritance for millennials is going to be about 63. So that's going to not kick in for a while for lots and lots of younger people. And obviously, we still want our parents and our grandparents to be around for as long as possible. But inheritance is something that's going to become more and more of a talking point in years to come. It's definitely becoming quite topical as to whether inheritance is going to become more taxed in the future. Younger people, if that's their main source of wealth that they will be relying on perhaps to fund their retirement, well, they're going to need some advice about how to manage that effectively, particularly if they want to reduce their tax liability. So I think for all those reasons, that younger generation should not be written off.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that is a perfect point for us to take a quick break, and we will be right back with you in just a minute. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of That NextGen Planners Podcast. Just as a quick interval in the episode, I wanted to remind you of a couple of very, very cool things we've got coming up in our NextGen Planners community. The first is the launch of the brand new Kinder Institute Hub on the community, filled with exclusive content by George Kinder himself, who is going to be speaking at our Next Gen Planners Elements Conference 2025 in July. He's got his own stage. He's got his own space. You're not going to want to miss it. Hopefully see you there. All the information on how to get tickets, how to attend will be on www.nextgenplanners.co.uk. Without further ado, let's head back to the episode.
Hello, welcome back to the podcast. And just before we had a break, we were speaking to Iona in relation to the financial planning industry and what we're doing right and what we could change. And I want to kind of steer now towards, Iona, if you don't mind, your book. So your book, Own It. Could you give us an overview of, firstly, why you wrote the book and what you were trying to achieve by writing it, and how can it help people with investing?
Well, I wrote the book in large part due to the reasons that we've been talking about when it comes to young people getting information about subjects that are quite complex, like investing, from social media. And my feeling was that young people were not necessarily getting the whole story. They were just going to get sound bites and bits of information taken out of context. But what they really needed was a friendly guide to hold their hand and take them through what can be quite a complex landscape, and to explain not just why they should invest, but how they should invest, and to do so with some humor and recognition of the financial problems that often mean young people don't feel that they can invest. And I wrote it at a time when actually, initially, I thought it was going to completely flop or not have any kind of relevance at all. And that was because we just came into lockdown, and I didn't think that young people would ever have any money left to invest ever again. But what we actually saw during lockdown was a real investing boom among younger people, partly because they were bored, sat at home with not much to do, and also because they had some cash on their hands, and also because actually we did at that time start to see certain investing platforms really take off, like Free Trade and eToro, and they gave investing a facelift. They gave it a brand revamp in a way. They made it seem younger, sexier, cooler, something that young people could do when they didn't necessarily have a lot of money. So I think with that came this need to contextualize all that and explain, how do these platforms work? Also, how does the more traditional side of the investment industry work? What's your pension? How does that work? How can you maximize that? How can you save for your first home? Should you save or invest for your first home? And then dealing with all the different aspects and assets in investments, and just really digging into those in a way that I felt would be kind of fun and accessible, down to earth, jargon free, and would help that person who was reading the book make an informed decision at the end of it as to not only, you know, how to invest, but also how to do it in a way that was sensible, and not going to open themselves up to too many problems. Because I know that young people cannot afford necessarily to lose lots of money through investing. And unfortunately, I have heard about a lot of younger people putting money into investments, particularly cryptocurrency, that they've gone on to lose. And I think that's a real shame, and that we can do more to try to prevent that.
Yeah, absolutely. And when looking at investing as well, I mean, what seems to be clear quite quickly is that there's still a massive gender inequality there in terms of who's investing, and why. And it's men predominantly who are doing the investing, and women not so much. But when women do invest, they seem to do better at investing and are being more considered. What what do you think about that landscape? How can we shift it so that we can encourage more women to be interested in it, so that we can get them involved in that landscape earlier on in their lifetime?
Well, firstly, I don't believe in diversity for its own sake. What I think is that if you have women talking about money on TV and radio, as I do, if you have women represented in financial advice businesses, that is not because you are doing a favor to those women and giving them a job to keep them busy and to keep them out of trouble. What you are doing is allowing other women to see that finance is for them. And I think in the world of personal finance media, sometimes, even when we have had women writing about money, they have very much, in the past, perhaps stuck to aspects of household finance, how to keep how to tighten the purse strings and manage family finances. I think that's all incredibly important. But what we haven't necessarily seen are women talking about what I would call big money, i.e. investments and pensions. And that's why you've ended up with a situation where often women, when they get divorced or separate or leave their partners, is that they are financially far worse off because they were not involved in any of those conversations. And then they were left out of any settlement that means they have that big gap in terms of their personal wealth compared to their ex-partner. And that's something I've been really trying to tackle in my work on Morning Live. It's become a bit of an unofficial mission of mine to talk about that gender pensions gap in particular, which I think is being driven by a few factors, one of which is actually how dysfunctional our state pension system has been, and how when there are state pension problems, guess who tends to be on the receiving end of that? Women. They fall foul of those issues. And we've talked about that a lot on Morning Live. And we're really trying to encourage older women out there to understand whether they have been underpaid their state pension. And if they have, to try to do something about it, even if they really have to fight for it. But I think another reason why women end up with a poorer pension or less pension is because they are left out of those conversations that their partners are having with financial advisors. And one example of that is the fact that you have, lots of men buying single life annuities even when they are married. Now, that might be a decision that they have taken with their partner, and both parties are totally informed. I have a feeling, though, that that's not what's happened. I have a feeling that what's happened there is that the male partner has decided the single life annuity will pay me more and will pay us more as a couple. And so that's the right thing to do. What if he passes away? Well, the partner's left with nothing unless there's a guaranteed period there. Whereas if they had a joint life annuity, up front it might be less, but over the course of the retirement, if that partner does pass away, then at least their surviving spouse has got something. So I think that's one example of many, many, many where we need to be including women more in those conversations. And it's not just on women to say, put their hand up and go, excuse me, can you tell me what's going on with our pensions and investments, please? It's not just for women to do that within their own households and relationships and families and so on. It's just on all of us, actually, to make sure that women are part of the conversation.
It's interesting. I read an article, I think recently, or about advice firms going to the ombudsman and actually losing, where they knew that there was a spouse and they did not consider putting a spouse's annuity on that annuity. And historically, they've gone back multiple years and given them compensation for the fact that they should have known and should have considered the affordability of the other spouse.
There we go. You see, so this is something that has been happening just far too often, and it's been happening under the noses of financial advisors as well. So I think hopefully that situation is improving and there's much greater awareness. But we don't want to have a situation where advisors are only doing this so they don't fall foul of the ombudsman or they don't fall foul of rules. We want them to be doing it because it's the right thing to do.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think it's really interesting as an advisor as well, based on what you're saying. I've had quite a few meetings where, I won't say quite a few, but I've had some where, similar kind of thing to what you're saying, where husband is very much taking the lead, and the wife sees this as, oh, I don't need to get involved sometimes, or this isn't my area. And I try and take it upon myself, and I hope other advisors would do the same, to challenge in a very polite way and say, well, actually, even if you're not saying specifically why you want her to be involved, but well, what if something happens to you? She needs to understand what we've set up, and it'd be really good if she's part of the conversation. And I think what's really nice to witness is then when women do become more confident. I always remember one of my first client couples. She was just terrified of talking about money or dealing with it, and so she just didn't want to get involved. And it's taken a few years, but now she's very active in the conversation. And I think, like you said, it's on all of us, but specifically advisors that are seeing this in meetings to call it out in a way that they feel appropriate. So yeah, thank you. I was just going to say thank you for highlighting.
Well, you're doing the Lord's work there, because I really do think that's the name of the game. And it's fascinating, really. I'm not sure why we have that kind of conditioning going on, whereby women can grow up with this very, very entrenched, ingrained sense that whole area is not for me. And when they get into relationships, they just completely outsource and delegate that to their partners. I don't know what really, really goes into that and causes that, but I think regardless, we are where we are, and it's going to take quite a while to unpick some of those attitudes. And I really do feel that half the battle is just seeing women talking about this and normalizing it. I think that way other women think, actually, that could be for me too.
What do you think? I've just hit me this kind of idea of talking about money and families. So, do you think that's changed? Because certainly when I was young, in my family, it wasn't discussed. I didn't know what anybody earned. I didn't know what savings anybody had. But now I think about it, just because we're talking about it today. It's the first I've thought about it. In a lot of my client families, the children are discussing this with their parents now. Do you think that has changed?
I think it's changed because it's had to change, because so many younger people are having to rely on their parents for financial support. I think they're having to have those conversations around how much can mum and dad provide me when it comes to my deposit, or, if, for instance, they want to buy with a partner and some family money is involved there has to be some difficult conversations around whether they want the partner to be a joint owner in the house or tenants in common, where there's any kind of difference in terms of what people can contribute to a financial situation. And if that's not all put on the table and everybody understand what that all means, then I think we're starting to grasp that further down the road, that can create massive, massive problems. And often the older generation can share a lot about the mistakes that they've made or the horror stories that they've heard about. And I think they're more willing to pass that on to the younger generations. And I think younger people are listening to that and taking that on board and realizing far better for us to talk about this stuff up front. Because actually, if anything goes wrong further down the road, I can't afford those consequences. So I definitely have to be on this. And so I think that's why we're seeing that more open intra-generational conversation happening.
For sure. And I just want to, before, I know we're running out of time, we're chatting away about all of this stuff, but in a conversation around money and younger generations, I feel like we do need to bring in tech into the conversation, because that is something that is hopefully making advice or guidance, at least, perhaps more accessible to people who it may not have been so available to beforehand. What do you think the trajectory of young people and money and tech is going to look like? Do you think that's going to be, we're going to see a bit more of a kind of robo-advisor role for them? Do you think it's, in person is still going to trump that? What's your view on that landscape?
I think in the future, in the future, hopefully we will be able to have a nice balance between technological solutions, hopefully, you know, enabling clients to do things that would otherwise have cost advisors time and money in the past. Hopefully, technology can just enable those efficiencies to happen. I mean, a really good example of this is this morning I woke up and I went on my banking app. And I'm buying a house this year. I've got lots of kind of expenses and costs to think about. And I've already done a lot of the sums, but there's an easy saver account just there available in my banking app. And I just decided on a whim, actually, I'm going to open that account because it's 4%. And, maybe I could put £20 a day into that account. By my calculations, I think I'd end up with, over £5,000 by the end of the year. So I thought, yeah, let's do it. There's no cost to me doing it, and it could be a good decision. It took less than a minute. It was so quick. I could not believe it. And I thought, this is just a million miles away from how the world of finance used to be. The fact that if I wanted to open that kind of account, 15, 20 years ago, I might even have had to have gone to my local bank branch to do it. Or at the very least, I would have had to have got on the phone or gone on my computer and gone through that whole process. To be able to just do it literally in my bed first thing this morning, just to me really showed how far we've come. And therefore, we have to be able to harness that kind of technology. I think there's a lot that could be done with regards to chatbots. AI is the big buzzword at the moment, and sometimes people just throw it out there and we think, oh well, we don't really know what that means, but it sounds good. Okay, fine. But actually, I do think that if we think through what the implications of AI are, what that means is that we could provide a lot of that simplified advice for the younger generation in a format that they want, in a format that they're used to. And we can hopefully enable them to be able to do things like open an easy access account, which will make a difference. It won't make a huge difference in the grand scheme of things. But hey, if someone ends up, £5,000 richer by the end of a calendar year as a result of that decision, I think that's better than nothing. So it's about looking for those ways that we can just incorporate that tech into the service whilst also being there for people. Because actually, as well, I know it's a cliche, but younger people do want to actually still have that in-person contact. They don't want everything to be done on their phone. And they do want a nice balance between technology and human touch.
So
For sure.
you're sort of our boots on the ground, I guess, as a journalist. What kind of trends are you seeing across the board, whether it's young people, people approaching retirement, people in retirement? What kind of themes are coming up and concerns that are coming up from the general public that you think the financial planning industry should be aware of and maybe being a bit more mindful of?
That's a really good question. I think, first of all, I'm really surprised at the lack of understanding and awareness of tax implications for pensions. I think generally speaking, and I apply this to financial media as well, we're not very good at explaining tax relief on pensions. So people don't understand, first of all, a very good reason to put money into pensions in the first place. But also people don't understand the tax implications when they're withdrawing money from their pension. And too many people are, as a result, paying tax. And I think the pension freedoms has created this double-edged sword where on the one hand, we've managed to move away from that very restrictive and often poor value world of annuities, but we've ended up with a situation in which people are having to make these decisions that could have really big consequences for them about their pensions, and they're not necessarily well qualified to do that or well informed to do that. There's still a massive advice gap, I think, when it comes to pensions. I often hear from people that even when they have what you would consider to be an all right pension, they're still being turned away by financial advisors who decide it's not worth their while. And I think that could be quite damaging long term for the image of the financial advice industry, because these are people actively wanting advice. We're not even talking about the young people yet who we have to convince to get financial advice. We're talking about those older people who actively want to get that financial advice. We have to be able to figure out a way to make that possible. Of course, it needs to be worthwhile for advisors. Maybe we need regulatory change. I don't know. I think that's open for discussion, but it's not a good situation to have so many people wanting financial advice and not able to get it. And then also, I think that there's a lot of concern now about the reduction of the cash ISA limit that's being proposed by the government. That's not going to happen straight away, probably won't happen until later this year after the budget, but it's causing a lot of concern among people. I think cash ISAs and just cash generally remain a very, very attractive option, especially for older people. We know what the downsides and drawbacks are. We know that they don't get people as good a return. And yes, maybe people do need to be investing more. Whether that's good for UK growth or not, it could be good for individuals' own personal wealth growth. That's what I'm kind of more concerned about. But I don't think the way that we do that is to force people to save less into cash and to invest more. I think we have to do more to win the argument. So I think that advisors perhaps need to be mindful that that's going on in people's minds at the moment, that they may feel like they're going to be railroaded towards investing in a way that they're not comfortable with. And we have to make sure that people are not forced down that path without their consent.
Yeah. Well, I think that is an excellent place to leave this conversation. I know, Taylor, Clara, you're like, no, more questions. I know, me too. I've got loads more to ask, but we're running out of time. So I've got to ask you our last question, which we ask all of our guests, and that is to set a question for our next guest. So the next person who sits down, what do you want to ask them to kick off the next podcast episode? It can be as silly as you like. It can be serious. What do you want to set for them?
Okay. If you could come back as something or someone else in the next life, what would it be?
That is an excellent question. You guys got any ideas? What do you think yours would be?
Do we mean come back as a person, or it could be anything?
Could be anything.
It sounds like
animal, vegetable, mineral, you name it. Probably not mineral. That would not be very fun.
I'd probably quite like to come back as a Shetland pony, if I'm honest. Just because I always feel that they're quite like they're close to the ground. Their food is very easily accessible. They're warm, and they just seem really happy. I've always
they
thought
haven't got any predators or anything, have they? So they're just chilling. Yeah.
yes.
What
about you, Paige?
Clara, anything springs to mind for you?
I feel like I'm stuck between some sort of existential crisis on whether I should be a molecule in something or whether I should just be a tortoise. I think I'm going to go tortoise because it's easier to explain the rationale, but just I'll be around for a while. I can kind of see time pass, but no one will really bother me, and I can kind of just exist and munch some grass and have a chill one. I think that's why. What are you really?
Yeah. I've got the first thing that comes to my mind is really pretentious, but I'll say it because that's what it. Do you know when light hits the water and it looks like it sparkles?
Definitely.
I think it's called glisters. I'll come back as that. I'll come back as the sparkles on the water.
Wow, this is very psychologically enlightening.
Don't read into it. Don't read into it. I don't know what that means.
Yeah, it tells you a lot about a person's psyche, what they say. This is a really, really interesting set of answers.
Go on, then. What about you,
I don't know what I would come back as. I don't know. I mean, yes, on the one hand, having an easy life like a tree, because a tree lives a long time. I love to see. Sorry, this is going to sound very hippie, but I love the seasons. I love the passing of the seasons. And that's why I could never live somewhere that was just hot all the time or cold all the time. I have to be able to observe that change in the seasons. So I think I'd really enjoy that process of shedding my leaves and then growing back new ones. But I mean, that could be true right across the whole flower community, to be honest. But I'll go with a nice kind of tree, like a big, what's the best tree? An elm tree. Let's say an elm tree.
Wow. Yeah, or a nice big oak or something lovely.
Yeah, oak, chestnut, because you get those little red flowers on them as well. Yeah, I'll go with the red chestnut. That's a great one.
That's a lovely answer. Oh, well, I look forward to hearing what our next guest says. The perfect question. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for joining us on this episode. It's been absolutely fantastic. It's been a pleasure talking to you. And I'll say thank you so much to Taylor and Clara for being brilliant. co-hosts. And thank you to everybody out there for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can listen to all of our previous episodes on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. But that's it from us. Thank you, Iona. We'll see you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the NextGen Planners Podcast. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can find all of our previous episodes on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, and on our website. Also, there is where you can find even more information about our brilliant community. And finally, if you can, do leave us a review. It really does help to grow the podcast.